The massive alien ship hung in space above Earth like a silver moon. It was 3 times bigger than anything humans had ever built. Inside the ship, hundreds of alien beings worked together in perfect harmony. They did not need to speak with words because they could share thoughts directly from mind to mind. Commander Vexstar stood on the bridge of the ship called Harmony's Edge. His body was made of living crystal that glowed with soft blue light. He had no mouth or nose, only large eyes that could see into the minds of others. Next to him floated Lieutenant Morthak, whose purple tentacles moved like water in the air. Morthak belonged to a species that had joined the Galactic Council 300 years ago. Both aliens felt confident about this mission. They had done this same thing 47 times before with other worlds. Every time it had worked perfectly. They would touch the mind of one creature from the new planet, and that creature would understand how wonderful it was to share thoughts with others. Then the whole planet would join their peaceful network of connected minds. Down on Earth, Captain Lee Daeho sat in his office at the Korean Space Force headquarters. The walls were covered with pictures of rockets and satellites. Lee was a tall man with serious eyes who had spent his whole life dreaming of meeting beings from other worlds. When the alien message came through his computers, he could barely believe what he was reading. The message was simple and direct. The aliens wanted to meet one human representative. They wanted to make peaceful contact through something they called mind-touching. Lee immediately called Dr. Park Min-seo, who worked at the International Center for Space Psychology. Dr. Park was a small woman with bright, curious eyes who had studied how different minds might work. She had written books about what it would be like to meet alien intelligence. When Lee told her about the message, she did not hesitate for even 1 second. "I will do it," she said. This could be the most important moment in human history. 3 days later, Dr. Park sat in a small shuttle floating halfway between Earth and the alien ship. Across from her sat Lieutenant Morthak, whose tentacles moved in slow, peaceful patterns. The alien had done this mind-touching ceremony hundreds of times. He expected it to be quick and easy. Through the shuttle window, Dr. Park could see both Earth and the alien ship. Her heart was beating fast, but she felt excited, not afraid. She had spent her whole life preparing for this moment. She thought about all the things she wanted to share with this alien being. She thought about human art and music and literature. She thought about love and friendship and hope. Morthak extended one translucent tentacle toward Dr. Park's forehead. In his species, this was how they shared thoughts and feelings. Every alien species they had met before had minds that were organized and calm. Their thoughts flowed in straight lines from one idea to the next. Their emotions were simple and easy to understand. The moment Morthak's tentacle touched Dr. Park's skin, everything went wrong. Instead of finding an organized mind, Morthak crashed into something that felt like a storm made of lightning and chaos. Dr. Park's thoughts did not flow in straight lines. They twisted and turned and doubled back on themselves. She was thinking about 17 different things at the same time. She was remembering her childhood while also planning what to eat for dinner, while also wondering what her alien visitor was, feeling while also composing a poem about the color of space. But the chaos was not the worst part. What truly terrified Morthak was something he had never encountered before in any species. Dr. Park could imagine things that did not exist. She could create entire worlds in her mind filled with people and places that were completely made up. She could dream of impossible things and make them feel real. Even more frightening, she could imagine terrible things. She could picture her own death and the death of everyone she loved. She could imagine the Earth being destroyed and all of humanity disappearing forever. She could think about pain and suffering and loneliness in ways that made them feel immediate and crushing. Yet somehow, despite carrying all of these terrible thoughts in her head, Dr. Park was not crazy or broken. She continued to live in love and hope. She could think about the worst possible things and still choose to be kind to others. She could imagine endless darkness and still decide to create light. Morthak had never experienced individual consciousness before. In his species and in every species the Council had met minds were connected and shared. No one had to face their thoughts alone. But humans were different. Every human carried the full weight of existence in their individual mind, and somehow they survived it. The alien telepath began to shake as Dr. Park's consciousness crashed over him like a wave. Through the telepathic network that connected all Council species, Morthak's terror spread instantly to every other alien on the ship. One by one they began to experience fragments of what it felt like to think like a human, Commander. Vextar, who had lived for 800 years in perfect mental harmony, suddenly experienced doubt for the first time. He felt the crushing weight of individual responsibility and the terrifying freedom of making choices that no one else could make for him. On the lower deck's alien crew, members who had never been alone with their thoughts suddenly found themselves cut off from the shared network. The isolation hit them like a physical blow. Some of them began screaming. Others curled up in corners trying to escape from their own minds. Dr. Park noticed that something was wrong with her alien visitor. Morthak had collapsed on the floor of the shuttle and his tentacles were writhing in what looked like pain. She immediately tried to help him, not knowing that her concern and kindness only made everything worse. The aliens could feel her genuine care for a being she had just met, and this selfless emotion was completely alien to their experience. Back on the main ship, alarms began blaring as more and more crew members succumbed to what they started calling the human madness. The telepathic network that had been their greatest strength was now spreading a kind of mental virus throughout their civilization. Commander Vextar tried to maintain order, but he was fighting something he had never encountered before. The humans had not attacked them with weapons or technology. They had done something far more devastating. They had simply shared what it was like to be human. As the chaos spread through the alien ship, Dr. Park continued trying to help the unconscious Morthak, completely unaware that she had just accidentally started a revolution that would change the entire galaxy forever. Commander Vextar had lived for 8 centuries without ever feeling afraid. Fear was something his species had eliminated long ago when they joined the great network of shared consciousness. But now, as he watched his crew writhing on the floor of his ship, he experienced terror for the first time. The telepathic link that connected every member of his species was carrying something new and horrible. Through that link, Vextar's mind touched the edges of what Lieutenant Morthak had experienced when he made contact with the human woman. It was like touching fire made of pure chaos. Human thoughts were not organized like alien thoughts. They did not flow smoothly from one idea to the next. Instead, they exploded in all directions at once. The human could think about her morning coffee while also remembering a song from childhood, while also worrying about a friend, while also planning her next research project, while also wondering what it would be like to fly. But worse than the chaos was something else. The human could imagine her own death. She could picture herself growing old and weak and disappearing forever, and somehow this did not drive her insane. She lived every day knowing that everything she loved would eventually be gone, and yet she continued to love anyway. Vextar felt his crystal body crack as this impossible concept crashed through his mind. How could any being function while carrying such terrible knowledge? How could they create anything knowing it would not last forever? How could they form relationships knowing everyone they cared about would someday die in? The shuttle Dr. Park Minseo continued trying to help the unconscious alien. She had called Captain Lee Deho and requested immediate medical assistance. She thought the alien might be having some kind of seizure or allergic reaction. She had no idea that her very presence was causing a mental breakdown across an entire spacecraft. Dr. Park knelt beside Morthak and gently checked his pulse. His alien biology was completely different from human biology, but she could see his breathing was rapid and shallow. She spoke to him in a calm, soothing voice, telling him that everything would be okay. She promised to take care of him until help arrived. These simple acts of kindness created new waves of confusion through the alien telepathic network. The other species they had encountered were logical and self-interested. They helped others only when it benefited them. But this human was showing genuine concern for a being she had never met before. She was willing to risk her own safety to help someone who was completely different from her. On Earth, Captain Lee noticed that something was seriously wrong. The alien ship had stopped responding to his communications. Through his telescope, he could see strange lights flashing inside the vessel. He immediately contacted Dr. Kim Hye-jin, who worked as a military psychologist for the Space Defense Force. Dr. Kim was a sharp-eyed woman who specialized in understanding how minds could be used as weapons. She had studied psychological warfare and knew how to recognize when someone was under mental attack. When Captain Lee described what was happening, she immediately understood the implications. "The aliens are not attacking us," she told him. "We are attacking them. Somehow, just by being human, we have hurt them in a way they never expected." Meanwhile, on the Galactic Council homeworld called Nexus Prime, Supreme Telepath Khaldun received fragmented transmissions from Morthak's consciousness. Khaldun was the oldest and most powerful telepath in the galaxy. He had lived for 3,000 years and had personally overseen the integration of dozens of species into the Great Network. But now, as he tried to process what had happened to the diplomatic mission, he experienced something that should have been impossible. For the first time in his long life, Khaldun felt doubt. The humans had not used any technology or weapons. They had simply shared their natural way of thinking, and it had broken one of his best telepaths. Khaldun called together the Council's greatest scientists and philosophers. They began analyzing the data from Morthak's encounter with the human. What they discovered challenged everything they thought they knew about consciousness and intelligence. Human minds operated on principles that should not have been possible. They could hold contradictory beliefs at the same time. They could love something while knowing it would cause them pain. They could hope for the future while accepting that they might fail. Most terrifyingly, they could contemplate their own non-existence without losing their ability to function. Every human mind contained what the Council scientists called impossible paradoxes. They were simultaneously individual and collective. They needed other humans to survive, but each one thought independently. They were logical creatures who made decisions based on emotions. They were creative beings who could imagine anything but chose to limit themselves with morality and ethics. Back on the diplomatic ship, the crew was experiencing something unprecedented in galactic history. As the telepathic network broke down under the weight of human mental patterns, each alien found themselves alone with their thoughts for the first time. The isolation was devastating. Engineer Quelmar, who had lived his entire life sharing consciousness with millions of others, suddenly discovered what it meant to be alone inside his own mind. The silence was deafening. He could not hear the comforting voices of his fellow beings. He could not draw strength from the shared wisdom of his species. He was trapped inside his own individual existence, and it terrified him. But something strange began to happen as the hours passed. Some of the aliens who survived the initial shock of individual consciousness started to experience something new. Cut off from the collective network, they began to have original thoughts. Ideas that belonged to them alone started forming in their minds. Communications Officer Threx discovered that she could imagine things that had never existed before. She found herself creating mental pictures of impossible colors and strange new shapes. These private thoughts felt dangerous and exciting at the same time. She had never experienced the joy of individual creativity because the collective network had always provided all the ideas anyone needed. Dr. Park finally managed to establish basic communication with the recovering aliens using simple hand gestures and drawings. She learned that touching her mind had somehow infected their entire ship with human-style consciousness. She felt terrible about accidentally hurting them, but she also felt fascinated by what was happening. Through careful observation, she began to understand that these aliens had never experienced individual thought before. They had lived their entire lives as part of a shared mental network. The concept of being alone with your own thoughts was completely foreign to them. To them, individual consciousness was not freedom, it was a kind of mental illness. As news of the incident spread through the Great Network, panic began to grip the galactic civilization. For the first time in their history, the aliens faced a threat they could not understand or fight. The humans had not attacked them with violence or tried to conquer them. They had done something far more dangerous. They had shown them a completely different way of existing. The question that terrified every telepathic species was simple, but devastating. If individual consciousness was possible, if beings could survive and even thrive while thinking independently, then was their way of life really the best way? Was the Great Network of shared minds actually necessary, or was it just one option among many? This doubt spread like a plague through their civilization as more and more aliens began to question everything they had believed about consciousness, community, and the nature of intelligent life itself. 3 days after the first contact disaster supreme, Telepath Khaldun stood in the great crystal chamber at the heart of Nexus Prime. Around him floated holographic displays, showing data streams from across the galaxy. Every display told the same terrifying story. The human consciousness pattern was spreading through their telepathic network like a virus that could not be stopped. Khaldun had spent 72 hours studying the recordings from Lieutenant Morthak's contact with Dr. Park Minseo. What he discovered made his ancient crystalline body tremble with fear. The humans were not just different from other species. They represented something that should not have been able to exist. Every species the Galactic Council had encountered shared certain basic mental structures. Their thoughts were organized and predictable. Their emotions followed logical patterns. When they felt happiness, they were happy. When they felt sadness, they were sad. They did not experience conflicting emotions at the same time, but humans were impossible creatures. Dr. Park could feel excited about meeting aliens while also being nervous about the danger. She could love her family while also being frustrated with them. She could hope for the best outcome while also preparing for the worst. Her mind contained dozens of contradictory states all existing together without destroying each other. Even more disturbing was how humans dealt with the knowledge of their own mortality. Every intelligent species eventually discovered that they would die. Most species found this knowledge so painful that they joined collective consciousness networks to escape the loneliness of individual existence. They shared their minds with others so they would never have to face death alone. Humans were different. They lived their entire lives knowing they would die, knowing everyone they loved would die, knowing their whole civilization would eventually disappear, and somehow this knowledge did not break them. Instead, it seemed to make them stronger. Dr. Park thought about death regularly, but instead of being paralyzed by fear, she used that knowledge to appreciate life more deeply. She loved her friends and family more intensely because she knew their time together was limited. She worked harder on her research because she knew she only had a few decades to make a contribution to human knowledge. This was the concept that terrified Khaldun more than anything else. Humans had learned to find meaning in meaninglessness. They had discovered how to create purpose in a universe that offered no guarantees. They could stare into the abyss of their own mortality and, instead of falling into despair, they chose to build something beautiful. On the Diplomatic, Ship Commander Vextar was struggling to maintain order as his crew experienced individual consciousness for the first time. Some aliens had been driven completely insane by the isolation of thinking alone. They huddled in corners, babbling about the horrible silence inside their own minds. But others were adapting in ways that fascinated and terrified Vextar. Engineer Quelmar had begun creating art. Using metal scraps from the ship, he built strange sculptures that represented his private thoughts and feelings. No alien in their recorded history had ever created individual, artistic expression because the collective network provided all the beauty anyone needed. Navigation Officer Plixon started keeping a personal diary where she recorded her individual experiences and observations. This was completely unprecedented. In their society, all experiences were immediately shared through the telepathic network. The idea of keeping thoughts private was considered selfish and antisocial. But Plixon found that having private thoughts made her feel more alive and authentic. Dr. Park continued working with the aliens, trying to help them understand what was happening to them. Through careful communication, she explained that humans were born with individual consciousness. They never experienced shared telepathic networks. Every human had to learn how to think alone and how to connect with others through language and action rather than direct mental contact. She tried to reassure the struggling aliens that individual consciousness was not a disease or a punishment. It was simply a different way of experiencing existence. Humans had built entire civilizations while maintaining individual thoughts. They had created art and science and philosophy precisely because each person could think independently and contribute unique perspectives. But many of the aliens could not accept this explanation. To them, individual consciousness felt like being cut off from the life force of the universe. They experienced loneliness as a physical pain. The silence inside their own minds felt like death itself. Lieutenant Morthak, who had made the original contact with Dr. Park, was slowly recovering from his mental breakdown. As he regained consciousness, he found himself changed in fundamental ways. He could no longer connect fully to the telepathic network. The human thought patterns had somehow rewired his neural pathways. Instead of feeling devastated by this change, Morthak discovered something unexpected. For the first time in his life, he had thoughts that belonged only to him. He could form opinions that no one else shared. He could disagree with the collective wisdom of his species. This newfound independence was terrifying but also strangely exhilarating. On Earth, the governments of all nations were beginning to understand the scope of what was happening. Dr. Kim Haijen worked with Captain Lee Daeho to analyze the situation. They realized that humanity had stumbled into a position of unprecedented power in galactic politics. The aliens possessed technology far beyond anything humans had developed. They could travel between stars and manipulate matter at the molecular level. Their ships could destroy Earth without any effort. But none of that mattered because humans had something the aliens could not fight against. Human consciousness itself had become a weapon more powerful than any bomb or laser. Simply by thinking the way humans naturally thought, Dr. Park had accidentally crippled an entire alien spacecraft. If this effect could be replicated or controlled, humanity might be able to defend itself against any alien threat. But Dr. Kim understood that this was not really about warfare or defense. The aliens were not evil conquerors trying to destroy humanity. They were simply a different kind of intelligent life that had developed in a completely different way. The conflict between humans and the Galactic Council was not about territory or resources. It was about two incompatible ways of existing. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the effects of the human consciousness pattern continued to spread through the telepathic network. Entire worlds were experiencing breakdowns as their citizens caught fragments of individual thought from the infected aliens. On the water world of Aquarius, 7 the dolphin-like cetaceans who had lived in perfect mental harmony for millions of years suddenly found themselves thinking private thoughts for the first time. Some of them went insane from the isolation. Others began to experience individual creativity and started composing personal songs that no one else could. Here on the crystal planet Resonance, the silicon-based harmonizers whose entire culture was built around shared vibrational frequencies found their collective music disrupted by individual discord. Some began to create new kinds of music that expressed personal, rather than communal experiences. The Galactic Council faced a crisis unlike anything in their recorded history. They could not fight an enemy that existed inside their own minds. They could not destroy a threat that was actually a gift of expanded consciousness. They could not return to their old way of life because too many of their citizens had now tasted the strange freedom of individual thought. Supreme Telepath Khaldun realized that the Council had only two choices. They could try to destroy humanity before the consciousness pattern spread further, destroying their civilization in the process. Or they could try to learn how to coexist with individual consciousness, accepting that their galaxy would never be the same. Again, the decision would determine not just the fate of humanity but the future of intelligent life throughout the entire galaxy. The galaxy split in half as the Great Network finally shattered. War Coordinator Zelkron led the traditional faction from his massive warship, called the Unity Hammer. His fleet contained over 10,000 vessels from species that wanted to preserve their collective consciousness way of life. They viewed humanity as a virus that needed to be eliminated before it could destroy their civilization. On the other side, Ambassador Threx commanded a smaller but growing fleet of ships, filled with beings who had been changed by exposure to human consciousness. They called themselves the Individual Alliance, and they wanted to learn from humanity rather than destroy it. Supreme Telepath Khaldun found himself caught between the two factions as his ancient authority crumbled. For 3,000 years he had been the voice of unity and shared purpose. Now half the galaxy refused to listen to collective wisdom, and the other half demanded that he use his power to destroy the source of their division. On Earth, Dr. Parkman Sale worked frantically to prepare humanity for what seemed like inevitable war. She had established communication with Lieutenant Morthak, who remained on the diplomatic ship trying to serve as a bridge between the two sides. Through him, she learned about the massive fleets gathering on both sides of the galactic civil war. But Dr. Park had a different plan than anyone expected. Instead of preparing for military defense, she organized teams of human volunteers willing to travel to alien worlds. These were not soldiers or diplomats, but teachers, psychologists, artists, and philosophers who could demonstrate how individual consciousness actually worked in practice. Captain Lee Deho thought this plan was insane. "You want to send defenseless humans directly into the middle of a galactic war," he said. "These aliens have weapons that could destroy our entire planet. How can teachers and artists possibly make a difference?" Dr. Park smiled with the same confidence she had shown when volunteering for the first contact mission. "Because they are not fighting us with weapons," she replied. "They are fighting each other over ideas about consciousness and identity. The only way to win that kind of war is with better ideas, not bigger guns." Dr. Kim Hee-jin supported Park's plan, but with important modifications. The human volunteers would not go to alien worlds defenseless. They would be accompanied by small groups of reformed aliens who could serve as guides and protectors. More importantly, they would carry something that had become humanity's most powerful weapon, their own consciousness. The first test of this strategy came on the mining world of Ferris Prime, where traditional collective consciousness aliens were fighting individual consciousness rebels in brutal ground combat. When the human volunteer team led by philosophy professor Dr. Yang Junho landed on the planet, both sides stopped fighting to stare at the newcomers. Dr. Yang did not bring weapons or technology. Instead, he brought books, music recordings, and art supplies. He set up a simple camp between the two armies and began teaching anyone who wanted to learn about human approaches to individual and collective consciousness. The results were immediate and dramatic. Aliens from both sides were drawn to the human camp by curiosity about the beings whose thoughts had started their civil war. When they met Dr. Yang face to face, they discovered something that neither faction had expected. Humans were not purely individual creatures any more than the aliens were purely collective beings. Dr. Yang explained that humans formed communities, families, and nations that functioned like collective consciousness networks. But they did this through choice and cooperation, rather than telepathic compulsion. A human family shares thoughts and feelings and works toward common goals, he explained, to a mixed group of traditional and rebel aliens. But each family member remains an individual with their own dreams and ideas. We are both separate and together at the same time. This concept fascinated aliens from both factions because it offered a middle path between the pure collective consciousness they had known and the pure individual consciousness that terrified them. They could maintain their connections to others while also developing personal identity and private thoughts. Within days, the fighting on Ferris Prime stopped as aliens from both sides began experimenting with hybrid consciousness models. They learned to share some thoughts while keeping others private. They maintained collective decision-making for important community issues while allowing individual expression in art and personal relationships. News of the success on Ferris Prime spread quickly through both fleets. More human volunteer teams were deployed to other conflict zones with similar results. Wherever humans went, they demonstrated that individual and collective consciousness were not opposites, but could work together in harmony. But war coordinator Zelkran refused to accept these developments. He saw the human influence spreading through the galaxy and knew that it would eventually destroy everything his faction was fighting to preserve. If beings could function with hybrid consciousness, then pure collective consciousness would become just one option among many, rather than the fundamental organizing principle of galactic civilization. Zelkran made a desperate decision. He would bypass the growing individual alliance fleet and attack Earth directly. If he could destroy the source of the consciousness virus, the galaxy could return to its proper collective state. His war fleet jumped through hyperspace toward the Sol system, carrying enough firepower to reduce Earth to radioactive dust. But Zelkran's attack faced an unexpected obstacle. Supreme Telepath Khaldun had finally made his choice between the two factions, and it was not what anyone expected. Instead of supporting either pure collective or pure individual consciousness, he had decided to sacrifice himself to save both sides. Khaldun used his massive telepathic power to make direct contact with every human mind on Earth simultaneously. This was the most dangerous thing any telepath had ever attempted. Touching one human consciousness had broken Lieutenant Morthak. Touching millions of human minds would certainly destroy Khaldun completely. But the ancient telepath had learned something from studying human psychology. Humans regularly made sacrifices for the benefit of others, even when those others were strangers or enemies. They could choose to suffer or die for principles that were more important than their own survival. Khaldun decided to embrace this human trait and use it to save the galaxy. The moment Khaldun's consciousness touched the collective human mind, the effect was unlike anything that had ever happened in galactic history. Instead of being destroyed by human psychological chaos, Khaldun found himself transformed by it. The Great Assembly Hall on Nexus Prime had never seen such chaos. Representatives from 400 different species gathered in emergency session as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. The human consciousness pattern was spreading faster than anyone had imagined possible. Supreme Telepath Khaldun stood at the center of the vast crystalline chamber, trying to maintain order as panicked voices filled the air. The methane breathers from the outer rim demanded immediate military action against Earth. The Silicon Collective insisted on building mental barriers to contain the infection. The energy beings wanted to evacuate entire star systems before the human madness could reach them. But the most disturbing reports came from worlds that had already been exposed to individual consciousness. On these planets, something unprecedented was happening. Instead of dying from mental isolation as the Council had expected, many beings were adapting to individual thought in ways that challenged everything the galactic civilization had believed about intelligence and society. Ambassador Threx from the diplomatic ship addressed the assembly through a flickering hologram. She had been one of the first aliens to recover from exposure to human consciousness, and her transformation shocked everyone who knew her. Before the contact, she had been a perfectly integrated member of the collective network. Now she spoke with a voice that belonged to her alone. Fellow representatives, she began, and even these simple words caused a stir because no alien had ever addressed the Council as an individual before. I have experienced what the humans call individual consciousness, and I must report that it is not the disease we believed it to be. Angry shouts erupted from the assembly. Several representatives demanded that Threx be removed from the session and undergo mental rehabilitation to restore her connection to the collective network. But she continued speaking with a calm confidence that was completely alien to their culture. I have learned to think thoughts that belong only to me, she said. I have created ideas that no one else has ever had. I have experienced emotions that are mine alone. And I have discovered that individual consciousness does not make you weak or selfish or insane. It makes you more capable of helping others because you choose to help rather than being programmed to help. Supreme Telepath Khaldun watched the assembly descend into chaos as representatives argued about what to do with their transformed colleague. Some wanted to study her to understand how the human consciousness pattern worked. Others wanted to exile her to prevent further contamination. A few radical voices even suggested that perhaps they should try to learn from humanity instead of fighting them. But the traditional faction led by War Coordinator Zelkran demanded immediate and decisive action. Zelkran was a massive insectoid being whose species had joined the Council by conquering and absorbing 12 other civilizations. His solution to the human problem was characteristically direct. We must destroy Earth before this mental plague spreads further, he announced. The humans are not just another species seeking to join our community. They are a fundamental threat to everything our civilization represents. Their very existence proves that collective consciousness is not necessary for intelligent life, and this knowledge will destroy us. The debate that followed revealed deep cracks in the Council's unity. Some species had always been uncomfortable with the complete loss of individual identity that came with joining the telepathic network. They had accepted it as necessary for peace and cooperation, but they had never stopped missing their private thoughts and personal dreams. Ambassador Quell from the Artistic Collective spoke quietly, but her words carried across the assembly. My people were painters and sculptors before we joined the network, she said. We created beautiful things that expressed our individual visions and experiences. When we connected our minds, we gained peace and harmony, but we lost something precious. We lost the ability to surprise ourselves with our own creativity. She paused and looked around the chamber. The humans have not lost this ability. They create new things constantly because each individual mind can imagine possibilities that no collective consciousness would consider. Perhaps instead of seeing them as a threat, we should see them as teachers. This suggestion horrified the traditional members of the Council. They had spent thousands of years building a civilization based on shared consciousness and unified purpose. The idea that individual thought might be superior to collective wisdom challenged their most basic beliefs about progress and evolution. Meanwhile, on Earth, humanity was beginning to understand their unique position in galactic politics. Dr. Park. Minseo had returned from her encounter with the aliens fundamentally changed by the experience. She had felt their terror when they touched her mind, and she understood that humans represented something unprecedented in their universe. Working with Captain Lee Daeho and Dr. Kim Heejin, she began developing strategies for dealing with the alien civilization. They could not match the Council's technology or military power, But they possessed something far more valuable. They had psychological weapons that the aliens could not defend against. Dr. Kim proposed a radical strategy. Instead of trying to fight the aliens or negotiate with them as equals, humanity should position itself as a teacher species. They should offer to help other civilizations learn how to balance individual consciousness with collective cooperation. This is not about conquering anyone, she explained to the assembled human leaders. This is about showing the galaxy that there are different ways to organize intelligent life. The aliens have built a successful civilization using shared consciousness. We have built a successful civilization using individual consciousness. Perhaps the future lies in combining both approaches, but not all human leaders agreed with this peaceful approach. General Morrison from the American Space Command argued for a more aggressive strategy. The aliens were clearly vulnerable to human psychological influence. This vulnerability could be weaponized and used to force the Galactic Council to leave Earth alone. As the debate raged on Earth, similar arguments were taking place throughout the galaxy. On world after world, beings that had been exposed to human consciousness patterns were making unprecedented choices. Some rejected individual thought and begged to be reintegrated into their collective networks. Others embraced their new mental independence and refused to return to shared consciousness. The planet Harmonia experienced its first civil war in 10,000 years as individual thinking citizens clashed with collective consciousness loyalists. The crystal beings of resonance split, began literally fracturing as their unified crystalline structure could not contain both collective and individual thought patterns. But on other worlds, the transition was more successful. The aquatic cetaceans discovered that combining individual creativity with collective cooperation allowed them to solve problems that had puzzled their species for millennia. They began developing new technologies and artistic expressions that neither pure individual nor pure collective consciousness could have achieved. Supreme Telepath Khaldun realized that the galaxy was at a crossroads. The old system of universal, collective consciousness was breaking down as more and more beings experienced the freedom and terror of individual thought. But the new system that was emerging was chaotic and unpredictable. Some worlds were thriving with their hybrid consciousness models. Others were destroying themselves as individual and collective factions fought for control. The Council faced an impossible choice between preserving their old way of life and adapting to a new reality that they could not fully control or understand. The reports from the diplomatic ship made the situation even more complex. Lieutenant Morthak, who had made the original contact with Dr. Park, was now serving as an ambassador between human and alien consciousness. He had learned to function with individual thought while maintaining limited connection to the collective network. Through Morthak, the aliens were beginning to understand that humans were not monsters or diseases. They were simply beings who had evolved differently, developing psychological tools that allowed them to thrive with individual consciousness. Their ability to face mortality and meaninglessness while still choosing to create and love was not a weakness, but a form of strength that the collective species had never needed to develop. As the emergency session continued into its third day, Khaldun made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. Instead of choosing between war and surrender, he proposed a third option. The Council would send diplomatic missions to Earth, not to integrate humanity into their network, but to learn from them. This proposal split the Assembly into two factions. The traditionalists, led by War Coordinator Zelkrin, prepared for military action to destroy Earth before human consciousness could spread further. The progressives, led by Ambassador Threx, began planning peaceful contact missions to study human civilization and learn how individual consciousness actually worked. The galaxy stood on the brink of transformation, as two fundamentally different approaches to intelligent life, prepared to either destroy each other or learn to coexist in ways that neither side had ever imagined possible.